Okay. All right. Okay. Welcome to our first individual presentation session for the AML conference. This morning we have three presenters. First, we'll hear from Emma Tueller Stone, then Kjerste Christensen, and then Liz Busby. Let's see. We are going to start with Emma Tueller Stone. She is a PhD candidate at Cambridge, researching the connection between YA speculative fiction published by Latter-day Saint authors and Mormon cosmological thought regarding gender, sex, marriage, and pregnancy. Her chapters include discussions of how YA love triangles speak to legacies of Mormon polygamy, dystopian world eugenic agendas, and God's, quote, monster body. When she's avoiding her real work with side projects, Emma is interested in the intersection of YA literature, popular culture, religion, imagined worlds, and social media. And Emma's presentation is titled Soulmates, Matchmaking, and Happily Ever After, a Mormon Literary Legacy.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jessie. And thank you for all of your patience as I remember how to share slides on Zoom. Someday I will know how to do this automatically. Can I get a thumbs up if that's working appropriately? Beautiful. And then forgive this Zoom screen in the top corner. Hello, I'm Emma Tueller. I take she, her pronouns, and today I'll be talking about romance, and more significantly, I'll be talking about how different genres of Mormon-authored young adult speculative fiction interpret the marriage plot and the idea of a soulmate. While my research on this talks extensively about Twilight and Ali Condi's Match series as well, I'm going to focus today's presentation on Shannon Hale's Books of Bayern series, specifically examining the love story at the center of her first novel, The Goose Girl, which is an adaptation of the Brothers Grimm fairy tale by the same name. As just a bit of housekeeping before I get started, I have an accessibility of my presentation linked through the QR code at the bottom of the screen that you all should be able to see. This will allow you to follow along with a written version of what I am saying and will also provide full citations for everything I'm talking about. I would just ask that you not share this beyond people who are attending this conference unless you think they'd really, really like it. In a similar vein, as some content warnings before I start my talk, I address issues of sexism in the context of religious ideology, as well as details of pregnancy. I try to handle these issues with care, but as always, please prioritize your own well-being. And I'll also just wrap up by saying that I'm using art from the cover of the Books of Bayern novels, as well as some illustrations from different versions of the Brothers Grimm fairy tale. And without any further ado, let's get started. Is it going to click? There we go. In between the Once Upon a Time and Happily Ever After, Hale's adaptation of The Goose Girl is relatively loyal to the content of the Brothers Grimm story. A marriage between a princess and a prince from different kingdoms is arranged, so the princess sets out on a journey to get to her own wedding. On the way, her maid attacks the princess and steals her identity, impersonating the princess as a false bride, while the real princess goes into hiding, working with the palace geese. Eventually, the maid's treachery is revealed, correct identities are restored, and the princess marries the prince. In the Grimm fairy tale, the eponymous Goose Girl, the real princess in disguise, is shockingly passive, even considering the infamous passivity of many of the fairy tale princesses. So while Hale's story largely tracks with the narrative arc, she deviates in the extent to which she gives shape to her princess, Annie, or in disguise as the Goose Girl, Izzy, as well as the world she occupies. I'm just going to click to. But one thing that doesn't change, of course, is the importance of the happily ever after. A prince and a princess happily in love, meant for each other. Which brings the Goose Girl fairy tale retelling into a conversation with yet another classic genre of literature, the romance, or more specifically, the marriage plot novel. The connection between fairy tales, romance novels, and marriage plot is fairly clear. While fairy tales have a bit more variation for how heroines can end their story, instead of getting married, they could, as a treat, die. But barring tragedy, all three end with a romantic couple, either married, engaged, or planning to spend their lives together. The primary variation is in the setting, and according to Linda Lee, the way that traditional motifs are reworked, in ways that can be repressive, empowering, or even eroticized. See your classic Bodice Ripper for more information on that last one. Because of the genre conventions in this type of storytelling, it's perhaps unsurprising that in fantasy and speculative fiction romance, the idea of soulmates comes up regularly. Because the heroine and her hero are destined by genre, plot, and reader expectations to end up together, throwing in a supernatural explanation for this inevitability often makes sense. However, this doesn't tend to happen in Mormon-authored young adult speculative romances, even though the idea of a fated or soulmate romance is often hinted at in the structure of the universe. For two quick examples, in Twilight, there are people who have a fated soulmate connection. The werewolves imprint on their perfect mates. But Bella, the heroine protagonist, and her romantic hero, Edward, are not soulmates in any specific or magical way. Similarly, in Ali Condi's Match series, a dystopian society arranges marriages between teenagers with their data-driven, statistically perfect match, which is supernatural only if one believes in the ability of data to consistently communicate anything universally accurate about human romantic behavior. But in the Match series, the characters actively undermine this system, rejecting the dystopian society in favor of a world where they can fall in love messily, with no perfect or ideal matches involved. The Goose Girl is slightly less overt about its rejection of soulmates. While Annie and her prince, Garrick, are in an arranged marriage, they fall in love while both in disguise, Annie as the Goose Girl, Izzy, and Garrick as a guard with access to excellent picnics. However, I'm going to argue that the Goose Girl rejects the idea of organized, fated, and flawless romances, just like the other examples of Mormon-authored texts in this genre, and that this rejection is connected to actual Latter-day Saint doctrines about marriage and meant-to-bes. Which brings me to Latter-day Saint traditions. Before I dive into talking about soulmates and Mormonism, I want to recognize that many other scholars, including Connor Hilton especially, have done really amazing research on this already. And while my research is on post-1985 Mormon-authored speculative fiction, it's important to acknowledge that there is a history in this genre. Because many of the iconic stories of LDS speculative and romantic fiction do involve the idea of soulmates, especially soulmates that exist because of love stories that occurred in the pre-existence. Nephi Anderson's Added Upon and the cult classic film Saturday's Warrior are some obvious examples in the 20th century. In spite of the cultural affection for this premortal brand of soulmate, church leaders have spoken out about soulmates as doctrine. For example, Spencer Kimball famously said that soulmates are a fiction and an illusion. While every young man and young woman will seek with all diligence and prayerfulness to find a mate with whom life can be most compatible and beautiful, it is certain that almost any good man and any good woman can have happiness and successful marriage if both are willing to pay the price, which is a surprisingly ominous and almost certainly inaccurate quotation. However, the use of the idea of soulmates as fiction and illusion is interesting. So while soulmates are not Latter-day Saint doctrine, marriage certainly is. And for many young Mormons, marriage is a question that circulates throughout youth curriculum and culture with major cosmological implications for what futures, both mortal and divine, might look like. Which brings me back, as I always tend to circle back to, young adult literature. So given the cultural significance of marriage as a covenant and temple ceremony in Mormonism, the already prominent position of romance in contemporary YA speculative fiction feels especially interesting. As young adult theorist Day says, young adult novels that feature a sort of 21st century marriage plot telegraph expectations about adolescent sexuality and the transition to adulthood by privileging heteronormative romantic conventions. I would add here that for Mormon-authored texts, we can also expect these stories to engage with specifically Mormon beliefs about marriage, family, and love. In other words, YA literature can offer a sanitized arena for adolescent protagonists and adolescent readers to ask an incredibly important question. What type of romance or eventually marriage do they want? For Annie, the protagonist of The Goose Girl, the answer to that question is very much in line with the plot of her story. She wants a relationship and a life where she can be herself again. As a reminder, the turmoil of her narrative starts when her lady-in-waiting, Celia, steals her identity and forces her into hiding as the Goose Girl, Izzy. When Annie, pretending to be Izzy, first meets Garrick, she briefly forgets her disguise. Reflecting on the interaction, Annie notes that while she was still the Goose Girl, she had been as bold as a queen with Garrick. And yet, while actually talking to Garrick, she hadn't felt particularly royal. Instead, quote, the anonymity of her Goose Girl costume and name gave leash to a freedom that she had never dared exhibit when she had been the crown princess shivering in her mother's shadow. As Annie starts to fall in love with Jarek, it's the blending of both selves, Goose Girl and princess, that allow her to truly fall for him. By focusing on Annie as a character, a self that could potentially be whole with a person she loves, Hale deviates from the fairy tale she is retelling. And that deviation goes even further when Annie finds magic and community fittingly through the power of a good story. Stories and language are recurring motifs in the Books of Bayern series. The magic system in this world works through learning different languages of animals or wind or fire or water. While Annie knew she had some talent for speaking to birds and a magical connection with her horse, it is only during her time masquerading as a goose girl that she really starts to master that language, learning to tell stories to her geese. Similarly, as she has to reckon with her grief and trauma, she eventually learns the language of wind, which whispers the story of the city to her when she's willing to listen. While hiding as the goose girl, Annie also befriends the other animal workers by telling them stories at night in between shifts. While her stories start fictional, she eventually gains the confidence to tell her friend who she really is, a princess pretending to be a goose girl with magical powers. After she recounts her story in full for the first time, Annie reflects that telling her story, quote, makes her want to change it, to make it sound pretty the way she does with the story she tells. And yet, in telling her imperfect, complicated, unfinished story, Annie is fully accepted by her community of animal workers who willingly volunteer to go with her to get her rightful place as princess back. In the telling and retelling of stories, Annie is able to build a community, and in doing so, she also steps outside of the confines set by the original Goose Girl story told by the Brothers Grimm, making her world and her cast of characters much bigger in the process. In the book Female Heroes in Young Adult Fantasy Literature, Leah Phillips argues that mythopoeic fantasy, or fantasy that is about the creation of mythic secondary worlds with belief systems, histories, and distinct identities, has the potential to shift classically patriarchal narratives like the hero's journey, or I would offer fairy tales, into stories that reject the limitations placed on girlhood by, at least in part, offering female heroes that opportunity to shape heroic stories with full and complex communities. Similarly, Lee argues that romances and fairy tale retellings specifically, quote, provide insight into the way women negotiate fantasy lives within patriarchal culture. In fact, Lee continues, these stories, quote, both reflect the values and sensibilities of the culture from which they emerge, and potentially transform the accepted norms through their imagined constructions. The Goose Girl does this because, while this first book does conclude with a happy romantic ending, it does not have a happily ever after. In fact, it's merely the first book in a quartet, with 3 additional books filled with danger, adventure, love, magic, community, and growth for Annie. And the continuing story expands beyond just Annie. In Enna Burning, the second book in the Books of Bayern series, Annie's best friend, Enna, realizes that she could not be content with the rest of her life now that she had seen all Izzy, Annie, had done. The 2 young women together figure out how the magic in this world works once Enna learns to speak to fire. They fight in and help win a war. Annie sneaks into an enemy camp when Enna is being held prisoner to bring her friend hope. And in telling these stories, a soldier aptly observes that Annie is, quote, fine at telling stories, but lousy at ending them. At the end of Enna Burning, while Enna and Annie are on an adventure far away from the kingdom, Annie realizes she is pregnant and gives birth away from Garrick and the privileges of her royalty. In its feminist potential, Philip argues that the female heroes of mythopoeic fantasy incorporate the body and its fleshy materiality, including the body's capacity to produce new bodies, within what it means to be a hero, making spaces for bodies that grow, break, bleed, and change, or in the case of Annie, give birth. The scene of a female YA protagonist giving birth is a really, really rare moment for young adult fiction. Hill describes at least a part of Annie's labor, saying that when the pains really started, Annie jabbered madly in the language of the South, bird tongue, and some curse words, shocking for this type of literature. And Annie was sweaty and tired, and sometimes she even cried a little, which feels like a very reasonable response to birth from what I know of it. And far from ending at her marriage, Annie's story extends into war, adventure, complicated and beautiful friendship, and even motherhood, without fear of stretching the boundaries of the fairy tale genre too far. And in so doing, transforms a limited world and a passive girl in the original story into expansive narratives and characters in Hale's version. But that's because the story has become something else entirely. I would also add that in mythopoeic fantasies, the female hero is able to live beyond her love story. Annie doesn't live happily ever after, nor does she reach the end. In creating an expansive world, it's easy to assume her stories continue somewhere, raising her son and spending time with her forest-born friends, ruling the kingdom of Bayern with Garrick at her side, supporting her as the full person she wanted to be the whole time. The last time Annie talks about stories in The Goose Girl is during a conversation when she and Garrick admit that they are indeed in love with each other. Garrick says, "You've a story I want to hear, Goose Girl," to which Annie replies, "And you have things to tell me, Sir Guard." Garrick answers, saying, "Well then, the first thing I would like to tell you, my lady, and I'd better tell it quickly because my heart is likely to break through my rib cage at any moment. The first thing is that I love you." Apart from being adorable, which let's be very clear it is, I want to end my talk by drawing attention to something really significant here. This conversation starts with an important acknowledgement. They both have stories, full stories, to tell each other, and they want to share those stories as part of their marriage, which is why it's also important how Garrick frames his declaration of love. Rather than a happily ever after or the end, it's just the first thing he wants to tell Annie, the first story, presumably, of many. In other words, Hale frames romance and marriage in The Goose Girl and her Books of Bayern series more broadly as the start of a story, rather than the end. But how does that contradict the idea of soulmates? Well, the thing about a soulmate is that the project is to find them. Once that happens, well, it's meant to be. That's the whole story. And all too often, that's the story that girls hear, both from fiction and realistically in Latter-day Saint youth curriculum and classrooms. It's the marriage plot and a romance and the end of all of the non-tragic fairy tales. But what Hale offers is so much more important and interesting than that. By transforming the Grimm fairy tale of the Goose Girl into the first book in the Books of Bayern series, the story switched from being a fairy tale to being the first part of a mythopoeic fantasy world. And in making that change, the princess became a character with community and complexity for whom marriage and romance can be important and significant and beautiful. But it isn't the only story, and it certainly isn't the full story. And in a genre where girls are often reduced only to their romantic potential, that isn't only good writing. It's actually radical. Thank you so much. That is all from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and mute myself. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emma. That was wonderful. We'll save questions for the end, and then we can have all of our panelists respond to them, even if the question's for a specific person. So we're going to go on next to Kjerste Christensen. Kjerste is a librarian at the Harold Bealey Library at Brigham Young University, where she catalogs 21st century Mormon materials. She's also a current co-chair of the Association for Mormon Letters. And the title of her presentation is The Lure of Happily Ever After, Mormon Authors and Fairy Tale Retellings.
Thank you, Jessie. So when I was brainstorming topics for a conference paper this year, I decided that I wanted to talk about the intersection between Mormon authors and fairy tales, building on Emma's talk, even if inadvertently. And the idea initially came to me because the AML is honoring Shannon Hale this year, but also because I personally really love fairy tale retellings and I love retellings in general. And because I've noticed through my work at the BYU Library and my involvement with the AML that there are a lot of Mormon authors writing them. So at first I'm just going to define what I would consider a fairy tale retelling. So I would define it as a work, usually a book-length work, that retells or otherwise adapts a pre-existing fairy tale. Retellings commonly play with the older story in a few different ways. They can modernize or otherwise change the setting. They can flip the perspective to make a different character the protagonist, such as the villain or a minor character. They can continue the story of a fairy tale past the traditional ending, or they can combine characters from multiple stories and have them interact in a new story. Or they can follow pretty much the same beats as the original fairy tale, but expand them into a longer narrative with more room for characterization, motivation, and detail. And I would say fairy tale retellings are a subset of retellings more broadly, where the original work could also be myth, it could be scripture, it could be some other work of classic literature, such as the plays of Shakespeare. So first, do Mormons actually write a disproportionate number of fairy tale retellings? It turns out that it's hard to calculate a statistically valid baseline of predicted fairy tale retellings. But anecdotally, it does seem like there are a lot of Mormon authors writing them. And I did a few quick searches of past AML award winners and other authors who seem to be Mormon or have Mormon connections, and I was able to make a pretty long list. So obviously Shannon Hale, who we're honoring this weekend, but also Orson Scott Card, Jessica Day George, Liesl Shirtliff, Jeanette Rallison, Meddy Ivy Harrison, Nancy Campbell Allen, Melissa Lemon, Rochelle Workman, Cindy C. Bennett, Helen Ketteman, Michelle Davidson Argyle, Elizabeth Loam, Jennifer Wardell, Ashley Lavering, Tara Montgomery, Rachel Huffmeyer, Rick Walton, Victorine E. Liskey, Jacqueline Weiss, Christy Tate, Elise Pearson, Maria Hoagland, Joe Schneider, Tony Larson, and Eric Peterson. And I apologize if I accidentally mispronounced any of those names. I did have to guess on a few of them. And of that list above, the works that they're based on included Beauty and the Beast, Cinderella, East of the Sun and West of the Moon, The Frog Prince, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, The 12 Dancing Princesses, and, of course, The Goose Girl. Now, some of this may be influenced by the fact that Mormon authors are well known in YA, and fairy tale retellings have been around as a very distinct subgenre for decades, especially in YA. This also may be influenced by the overlap between Mormon authors and fantasy books, but regardless, there are a lot of authors who are playing in that space. So when I was trying to think of what the connections might be between authors and Mormonism and fairy tale retellings, the first thing I decided to do was think of some terrible reasons that people might say that Mormon authors write fairy tale retellings. And these are not specific arguments that I've actually heard, but the themes are extrapolated from real comments I have heard about Mormons and Mormon culture. So Mormonism is just fan fiction of Christianity. So by extension, Mormon authors can't think of anything new to write, and are thus condemned to write pastiches and pale imitations of pre-existing stories, such as stories by real authors or stories that come from real culture. Ouch. As someone who loves fairy tale retellings, I reject the idea that there's anything inherently inferior about them. Just because a work is clearly referencing another work, that doesn't mean it's of poor quality. That doesn't mean the author lacks originality. There are retellings that are well written, and there are retellings that aren't well written, but that's the same as in any other genre or style. That's like saying fantasy authors write fantasy because they can't handle the real world. Like, no, there are reasons for writing in a genre, there are reasons for not writing in a genre. And if you think all retellings are inherently inferior, tell it to Tom Stoppard, who won a Tony Award for Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, even if it's pretty clearly based on Hamlet. Grab a drink of water. Okay, another argument, Mormons can only handle fairy tale endings. Not all retellings have happy endings, and some fairy tales, at least in their earliest form, are quite dark or are quite dark on their way to a happy ending. Furthermore, expanding a short tale into a longer work frequently allows an author to give more depth to the relationship between the characters, especially when it comes to romantic relationships. So if the original tale has a couple getting married after basically 2 or 3 dates, a retelling can deepen that relationship into something that is a healthier model, even in a fantasy setting. And there are reasons that people write stories that have happily ever after endings. There are reasons that people write stories that have sort of happily ever after endings or difficult endings, but I don't think there's a correlation between people not being able to handle reality. So as I've mentioned, fairy tale retelling is a specific genre that's been very popular for the last few decades. And so Mormon authors are far from being the only ones who are writing retellings or fairy tale retellings. So other authors in the genre very notably include Robin McKinley, Marissa Meyer, Gregory Maguire, Gail Carson Levine, and Naomi Novik. And that's just barely scraping the surface. So why would anyone write a fairy tale retelling? What is the draw there? I would say that art is a conversation, that artists draw inspiration from all kinds of places. Some artists may want to reference previous works very directly, and some may find it easier if they have a concrete outline to work with. In addition, some may want to look at an old story in a new way as a way of directly questioning some of our previous cultural preconceptions. As another option, or another reason authors might write fairy tale retellings, classic fairy tales are in the public domain. So authors are free to experiment with stories that are part of our cultural consciousness without having to track down who owns the rights to something or having to work with lawyers from giant companies. And that doesn't mean that every attempt to work with public domain characters will be successful or worthwhile, but it does mean that a lot more people get to try their hand at doing something really interesting with those characters. So coming back around again, why does it matter that Mormons specifically are writing fairy tale retellings? Well, we are a record-keeping people. When I was growing up, writing in a journal was very strongly emphasized, and we run the largest genealogical database in the world. Um, in some senses, something isn't real in our culture until it's written down. And fairy tales often do not have one canonical original form. Remember that people like the Brothers Grimm were primarily collecting pre-existing stories, not just inventing them out of whole cloth. So by retelling these stories, we are in effect taking something that has an ephemeral form and fixing it into a concrete form as a record keeping and as a storytelling people. I do think it's unfair to call Mormonism or the Book of Mormon fan fiction of the New Testament. I think that's offensive to the Book of Mormon. I think that's offensive to fan fiction. However, it is certainly fair to say that Mormon ideas developed in response to pre-existing Christian ideas, and modern fairy tale retellings certainly exist in response to traditional fairy tales. Modern retellings pull stories apart, they examine the pieces, they put them together in new ways, or they put them back together in old ways, but with new meaning. Also, as Mormons, we grow up hearing that we should liken the scriptures to our own lives. So events in the scriptures have one meaning at the time they happened, another meaning at the time they were recorded, another meaning between then and now, and still other meanings in the present day. In the same way, fairy tales and folk tales may have had one meaning when they were first circulating orally, another when they were being recorded in various forms, another when they were first adapted, and yet another in the modern era, and every time they are re-examined. We are also raised with a concept of continuous revelation and an open canon. We hear talks that reference and build upon church history, the Book of Mormon, the New Testament, and the Old Testament, and yet those talks still move us forward into the uncharted future. Likewise, revisiting old stories is a sign that our work in literature is not yet finished, that the past continues to speak to us, and that we still have more to say in response. And some people get frustrated and tired of story retellings, and they say they want stories that are new. I don't think that any story is actually completely new out of whole cloth, but even those who prefer new stories must accept that every new story then becomes a potential seed for still more retellings and responses.
Thank you, Kjerste. Our third presentation is from Liz Busby. Liz is currently doing graduate work at BYU on the intersection between Mormonism and science fiction fantasy. She blogs about the intersection of faith and fantasy on Substack, and she is also the co-host for the podcast Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, which examines movies and TV from a Latter-day Saint perspective. Liz's presentation is titled Withheld Recollections, Memory Erasure, and Agency in Latter-day Saint YA Dystopias.
Okay, I'm gonna get my slides going here. Okay, is that working? Give me a thumbs up, guys. Yay, let me just move this bar. Okay. All right, so there we go. Okay. The malleability of cultural memory has long been a trope of the dystopia genre, with an oppressive government controlling the past by wiping it from memory. 1984 and Fahrenheit 451 both have governments destroying information or changing information to change the past and thus control their populace. And A Clockwork Orange focuses on the manipulation of individual memory to control agency. Scholar Jorge Bastos da Silva observed that in dystopias, the control of memory is a means of controlling agency by limiting the availability of choice. Memory and agency become an even greater focus as the dystopia rose in popularity as a genre for young adult readers in the 90s and early 2000s. In The Giver, one person is chosen to carry all of society's memories while everyone else lives a predetermined and happy life. And the Hunger Games series features Peeta being brainwashed with the impulse to kill Katniss. The games themselves are also a type of memory modification, constantly reinforcing the Capitol's version of history about their historical relationship with the districts. The interaction between memory and individual agency has also been a prominent theme in LDS fiction, especially in that most Mormon of genres, the pre-mortal epic, Works like Added Upon and Saturday's Warrior ask whether characters will be able to follow through on the intent they have forgotten when they've forgotten what they used to know. This theme is also elaborated on in Latter-day Saint speculative fiction novels like Orson Scott Card's Worthing Saga and Stephen Peck's Heike's Void. Two popular YA dystopian series written by Latter-day Saint authors, Matched by Ali Condi and The Maze Runner by James Dashner, also feature an interest in the effect of individual memory on the exercise of agency. So in this presentation, I'm going to examine how the Latter-day Saint concept of a forgotten premortal existence interacts with the dystopian trope of memory erasure in these two novels and creates a distinctly Mormon version of the dystopia genre. So unlike many other Christians, Latter-day Saints do not believe in creation ex nihilo, but rather in creation as the organization of eternally existing matter. This pre-existing matter includes intelligences, which were shaped by God into human souls. According to LDS scripture, intelligences were organized before the world was, and helped participate in the creation of the physical world. This idea of a participatory creation is twisted in both The Maze Runner and in Match to show how the protagonists are complicit in creating the system that they're going to fight against. This is most apparent in The Maze Runner. The main character, Thomas, arrives in the Glade suffering from amnesia, and the early chapters of the book consist of him gradually learning about the Glade, which is a small forested area containing a society of teenage boys who've all lost their memory, who work together to survive by farming while occasionally receiving mysterious supplies from the outside. Surrounding the Glade is the maze, a labyrinth that prevents their escape and is filled at night with monsters called grievers. As Thomas becomes more familiar with his situation, he frequently experiences flashes of déjà vu, where he seems to know more about the operations and structure of the maze than he ought to. He tells his friend Chuck, "I think I've been here before." Thomas's intuitive knowledge could be seen as sloppy storytelling. Having your character instinctively know whatever the plot demands is generally considered bad character motivation because it requires no justification for their decisions. But if we view him through the lens of a participatory creation, this technique suddenly makes sense. Thomas's memory has been erased because he helped create the maze, but he needed to experience it without understanding. When some of the boys are attacked by the grievers, they go through a process called the changing, during which they regain some of their memories. In these memories, several boys see Thomas collaborating with their captors. Albie tells him, "You were with the creators, helping them." Eventually, Thomas himself goes through the changing and retrieves his lost memory, confirming, "Teresa and I helped design the maze. We helped create the whole thing." The experiment that the boys are stuck in is not one of someone else's design or an accident of history, but one that they created themselves. This conclusion gets complicated in further books of the series, but looking just at this one, nonetheless, in some amount, Thomas and Teresa helped design the maze and agreed to experience it to help cure a dangerous disease that's threatening the world. Even though the maze is a dystopia, it also has a purpose in that the protagonist actively chose to participate in. Matched depicts characters participating in creating their dystopia in a little bit less direct and more traditional way. In the novel, a government called the Society carefully monitors every aspect of human life and maximizes it for the statistically best outcome. The story begins with 16-year-old Kasia attending her matching ceremony where her perfect marriage partner will be revealed. Unlike Thomas's dystopic experience in The Maze Runner, Kasia's life is fairly happy, which is perhaps why so many members of her family participate in propping up the society. For example, her mother works as a botanist and decides to report a group of rebels who are attempting to grow crops outside of the society's tightly controlled food production system. Kasia doesn't know that her mother is making this decision at the time, but she observes her reminiscing about the happiness the society has brought her by looking at the scrap of fabric from the gown that she wore to her own matching. That blue cloth represents the night she was matched to my father. She reads her life, the life she loves, in that square of blue satin. There's a sense of sadness from Kasia's mother about turning in the rebels. She doesn't really want to do it. And yet she makes a conflicting decision to continue participating in the system because it seems as perfect as it's possible to make it. And it has brought her happiness and the people around her happiness. Her father and grandfather are portrayed in similar ways. None of them are unquestioning believers in the society, as many adults in YA dystopias are, yet all of them continue to make hard choices that keep the system going. Kjerste herself participates in the system throughout the novel, even though her own feelings of regret are growing stronger as she learns more about the costs of the society. Kjerste's career training is in the algorithmic sorting of data that is the backbone of the society. And at the test that will lead to her final job placement, she explicitly casts her participation in religious terms that invoke the importance of free will. I didn't play God or angel, I played official. I let myself think that I knew what was best and changed someone's life accordingly. It doesn't matter whether or not the data backed me up. In the end, I made the decision myself. Though she grows more ambivalent about the society until she resolves to leave, it's a bittersweet rebellion, one that sees the good in the system. In a confrontation with an official near the end of the novel, she thinks, if she had a way to track all of my memories, she would see that I truly wanted to fit in and be matched and do everything the right way, that I truly believed, that part of me still believes. In fact, this participatory creation of an ambiguous dystopia seems unique to these two stories. In Kjerste's rebellion, there's none of Katniss's defiance of the capital, which is shown as completely unredeemable. And even in The Giver, where the dystopia is a happy but controlled life similar to the society, Jonas lacks the familial love and the genuine happiness that Kjerste has at many points in her story. Additionally, the protagonists of other YA stories are generally either victims or low-level participants in the dystopian system, rather than those who are actively helping to perpetuate it. The unique structure of these two books, an ambiguous dystopia that the characters choose to construct, may be related to Latter-day Saint beliefs about our pre-mortal ascent to the conditions of mortal life. The recognition of participation in creating the dystopia also gives a more complex perspective on how dystopias happen. Unlike the flimsy justification of the capital and district system in the Hunger Games, both of these novels recognize that sometimes painful circumstances are created from a genuinely positive purpose, even though they will eventually need to rebel against it. In fact, these ambiguous dystopias may be a representation of the LDS idea of the necessity of opposition as a component of choice. Since the complete information of the premortal life would provide an obvious correct answer to many of life's questions, Latter-day Saints believe it was necessary to forget our premortal life to have mortality act as a real test. For example, Elder Neil A. Maxwell explained, it seems clear, not only scripturally but logically, that mortality could not include the direct memories of our first estate. If such were to impinge overmuch on this second estate, our mortality would not be a true proving ground. In this way, LDS theology asserts that definitive knowledge removes the ability to struggle with a choice. Thus, in a dystopian novel where there are enticements both in favor and against the dystopia, the protagonist can more freely exercise their agency. I've already discussed how the characters in The Maze Runner have had their memories wiped before being placed in the experiment. Only their forgetting allows them to struggle and make choices to grow into the strong and smart people that the world needs to save it. More than this, the book also posits that the world they've forgotten is actually a terrible place, that they needed to forget so that they'd be motivated to try to escape from the maze. Indeed, the characters who go through the changing seem to lose their motivation to leave the maze. For example, Ben attacks Thomas when he recognizes him from his recovered memories, not because Thomas is the one who put them in the maze, but because he'll want to get us out of the maze. Better we all jumped off the cliff. Better we tore each other's guts out. Even though life in the glade is harsh, the book asserts that it's a controlled paradise compared to the outside world, which has descended into lawless chaos after multiple overlapping catastrophes. This fear of leaving the dystopia seems like an ironic inversion of LDS folklore about life beyond the veil being so amazing that people would kill themselves to go there. In contrast, most YA dystopias feature knowledge as a positive thing. In her analysis of the structure of YA dystopian trilogies, Rebecca Fitzsimmons notes that the protagonist must gain knowledge to come into their agency as an enemy of the dystopian system. Knowledge usually is presented as an empowering good that allows the protagonist to finally make a choice whether to participate in the dystopia or hasten its demise. The Maze Runner presents an inverted version of this trope. Once the boys understand the nature of their dystopian system, they're more unable to act than ever. The novel recognizes the ambiguous nature of knowledge and memory as something both necessary but also painful, a theme we'll return to later. Matched focuses in another way On another way that knowledge constrains agency, the society has nearly comprehensive knowledge of human behavior through statistical prediction. Though Cassia is matched to her childhood friend Xander, she ends up falling in love with Kai, a loner whose picture appears accidentally on the microcard the society gives her. Their romance is a transgressive action that they hide from the society. At the end of the novel, it is revealed that far from being a secret, their romance was set up, or at least allowed to continue, by the society as an experiment. As an official explains that Cassia was predicted to have rebellious feelings, that they allowed her interactions with Kai to continue to test her loyalty, and that by the time you're 21, there's a 95% chance that your rebellion will be all over. When Cassia finds this out, she is devastated that they have taken the one thing in my life that I thought happened in spite of them. The society's ability to predict her actions creates a suffocating version of reality where no agency is possible because the end is known from the start. This struggle against omniscience could be seen as reflective of the LDS reaction to the idea of predestination, where all human actions are foreknown by God. The book does this in two ways. First, it asserts that foreknowledge does not invalidate the reality of choice. As Kai explains to Cassia, you don't throw something away just because they predicted it. Less knowledge about the reasons behind her choices allows Cassia to maintain the ability to see them as choices, rather than as following a script, just as the forgetting of premortal choice allows the appearance of agency to occur in mortality. Secondarily, Cassia also discovers that the society's knowledge of human action is imperfect. They don't know who put Kai's name into the matching pool, but merely predicted a chain of events from that action. This assertion of imperfect knowledge relates to a more controversial position taken by some Latter-day Saints that God is not sovereign over our actions. Terrell Givens, a prominent LDS theologian, explains that he believes the concept of God as the author of everything that happens is one of the disasters of Reformation thought, leaving no room for human choice. Granted that many other Latter-day Saints would disagree with this perspective, it does seem to fit with what Matched asserts about human agency, that choice matters because it cannot truly be known in advance what we would do, either by the panopticon or by God. This view of a limited God also plays into the Latter-day Saint conception of the fall. Unlike much of Christianity, LDS theology asserts that the fall was a necessary element of God's plan. President Dallin H. Oaks has asserted that God could not introduce humanity into the planned state of mortal trial without their choice. This perspective on the fall again introduces the concept of participation. Rather than acting against God's will, Eve cooperated with God and made a bold decision to choose agency and knowledge over safety and innocence. In the version portrayed in LDS temples, once Adam and Eve partake of the fruit, they also regain some of their premortal memory. Both Matched and the Maze Runner feature an Eve-like character portrayed as a positive decision maker. In The Maze Runner, Teresa and Thomas serve as analogs for Eve and Adam, though in an inversion, they're sent into the maze last rather than first. Teresa is the first girl to be sent into the maze, and as with Genesis, the introduction of woman changes everything. Thomas, like Adam, helps name Teresa. He hears her name in his head while Teresa is still unconscious and is the first to speak it out loud. While many of the Gladers worry about what her arrival means, Thomas declares his confidence in Teresa's goodness. Just because she was the trigger for the ending doesn't make her bad. In the end, Thomas chooses to be stung by a griever to get the knowledge he needs to help Teresa, analogous to Adam's choice to follow Eve in the fall. Teresa serves as the trigger for a painful yet necessary action that breaks the stagnation of the glade and completes the plan of the creators, the same function that Eve serves in the LDS view of the fall narrative. The parallels between Cassia in Matched and Eve are perhaps even more obvious. Her growing relationship with Kai occurs in the pristine wilderness of the Arboretum, an echo of the Garden of Eden. In a dream, she literally eats the forbidden knowledge represented by the poems her grandfather gave her. The words taste bitter, but she decides that eating them is necessary to further understand them. After Kai and Cassia's forbidden relationship is sealed with a kiss, both Kai and Cassia's family are exiled to the outer provinces. As this is going on, Cassia's old street is given a new name, Garden Burrow. After she's cast out of this garden, the first image we're given of her new life is of her tilling the soil, similar to the punishment meted out in Genesis. Like Latter-day Saint theology and the Maze Runner, Matched presents an Adam and Eve united in their decision to fall, rather than Eve as a temptress. When Cassia determines that she will not go gentle, but will rebel against the society, she breaks open the scrap of fabric from her matching dress and presents it to Kai on their last climb up the hill, and Kai, like Adam, accepts her gift. Together, they climb the hill, and when they reach the summit of their rebellion, it is not a tragedy, but a triumph. We stand together in a place where neither of us has been before. Though this act leads to their expulsion, they both believe that it was important to do it together. Compare this to Katniss, who's always one step behind Peeta in her understanding of the rebellion. In both Matched and the Maze Runner, the step towards resistance is made not by an individual, but by a couple jointly working together to choose something that they know will be painful, but ultimately for their good. This choice towards knowledge at the end of each novel creates a paradox with the relationship between memory and agency presented earlier. Both stories assert that memory is central to agency, but somehow also a hindrance to it. Unlike in other YA dystopias, memory is not an unalloyed good that gives one power, but something ambiguous that brings both joy and sorrow, that both liberates and constrains. Perhaps these beliefs about the ambiguous nature of memory are why these dystopias are more complex than a simple fight against a controlling oppressor. Unlike the Capitol in the Hunger Games, both the society and the maze have a valid reason for existing. As the protagonists come to see the ambiguous nature of their society, the memories that come back to them bring both empowerment and a sense of loss. It's a common coming-of-age experience, but with a Latter-day Saint twist. Rather than a chance to fight against a dystopian system, these books assert that there is no utopia, that all joy comes with pain, but that we have a choice about which joy and pain we want. Their protagonists step away from the dystopia not because it is wrong, but as an assertion of agency. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Also, I apologize. I forgot at the beginning to note that Reed Nielsen was also listed on this panel, but unfortunately he was trying to travel yesterday and that did not go well. So hopefully he will make it home soon and we can hear from him at a later date. So I think this was great as I was listening to all of these. And we've got several really good questions, so we've got plenty of time for questions too, since we're slated till 10:15. As I was listening to all three of these presentations, I thought about an ongoing conversation my husband and I keep having about, is there a plan of salvation or does God have a plan for each individual person and how do they interact? Because sometimes at church you hear people talking about, well, God's plan for me versus the plan of salvation for the earth. And these questions of agency in all of these aspects of our lives. So I felt like all of these things really look at how Mormons view that, you know, we have a lot of interesting ideas about agency, predestination, how God works in our lives, you know, is God working on us all the time and he has a specific plan for each individual, or is there one large plan? And I think all of these presentations spoke to that, you know, thinking about Emma's presentation about love and soulmates, because that is, you know, it's been a long time since I've been in LDS youth, but man, that was such a big thing, you know, like all the time. Okay, the biggest, best thing you're going to do is find your person and get married. And then you'll figure out the rest of your life after that. We aren't going to talk about that. And then thinking about fairy tale retellings as well, when you have basically a preordained, foreordained text that everybody's kind of following along, do we have agency as writers to vary from that? And how much you vary from that, does that make it the text still, or is it completely now a new text? And what are the working within the constraints of a pre-written story? How much agency do writers and readers have to construct it and make it their own and assume things about characters that already exist that may not have already been said? And same thing with Liz's presentation. It's funny, out of all the dystopias, I really love Matched, and I've always loved Matched, and maybe it's because I'm very Mormon and I like the ideas of Matched. I don't know. But again, some really interesting ideas about how Mormon authors may not, I guess that would be one question that I'll start with, and then we have some really good questions. As I'm thinking about Liz's presentation of all of these, I guess my question for all of you is, do you feel like Mormon authors are consciously working with these questions of agency? Like, is this a deliberate choice? I'm going to write a novel that explores questions of agency, or I'm going to write a story that explores these things. or do you think it's somewhat subconscious that this is just how, as Mormons, we're viewing the world, and so these are the stories we write? So I think we'll start with that, and then we've got some good questions from the audience. I don't know who wants to go first.
I mean, I can go. I think we do consciously think in terms of agency. I think it's one of the things that makes books that Mormon authors write very strong, is because they are thinking in terms of the character's agency, which makes for a very strong narrative. I'm thinking of this in comparison to there's a prominent science fiction author who a couple years ago published an essay on Tor.com about like the rejection of the agency of the protagonist because they're really, stuck within the system, and it limits their ability to choose. And we should stop creating stories where people have agency because they don't actually have choices because the system is limiting them. And that's a perspective, but I don't think it's one that many Mormon authors would resonate with. We consciously choose narratives that allow us to give our characters agency and to make those choices. I liked your question or thought about the idea of a plan for me versus the plan. And I think I can see that contrast between the two novels I looked at. The Maze Runner is much more, there's an overarching plan for this experiment, and you have a certain role, but you're more of a cog in the plan that we're trying to implement, rather than it being a specific plan for you. Whereas Matched is much more focused on the introspection of a person and thinking, do I want to participate in the system, and how? What should my role be? What do I feel? It is much more what is God's plan for me, rather than what is my role in the plan.
I can speak to agency a little bit as well. I find it especially interesting thinking about agency in a Mormon context, because agency is also a huge question for feminist children's literature studies. In a lot of ways, the extent to which characters are given agency often becomes the measure of whether a book is feminist, is empowering, and whether it's offering women the chance to make better choices, or girls, I guess, in these books, since they're mostly under 18. And I think I sometimes struggle with that as the only focal point of a conversation about whether a book is empowering and a character is well developed, is how much agency are they given. I think one of the things that I specifically love about The Goose Girl is that, in contrast to a lot of fairy tale retellings that are often really lauded for what they do for empowerment and for undermining fairy tale narratives and going against the kind of Disney princess strategy, and I love many of those, but Shannon Hill does stick to the plot point. She has characters with the same names. She quotes the original story. The horse is still named Falada, and he still dies tragically, and I'm still mad about it every single time. But what she does instead is insist that, and there's more. And so I think agency is an important question, but I think agency only is an important question when we also measure the complexity. And I loved that about what Liz was saying about this idea that, like, you need the veil, you need the opposition, you need that genuine choice. And a genuine choice is more than just agency. It's also, how complex are these characters? How much of a world are they given? How much of a person are they given? Are they actually measuring stuff inside themselves as well as the difficult circumstances? Which is maybe just a measure of like how real are characters allowed to be, and also how real are we allowed to be? And I do think Mormons are particularly good at that in their books.
I guess I'll approach this from a different perspective of kind of why you would read a story if you know how it's going to end. I'm in an online forum that is very, very sensitive to spoilers, and that's fine. I am probably less sensitive to spoilers than average, just because sometimes it takes me a while to get around to watching something or reading something, so by then it's been spoiled for me. But this forum is so careful about spoilers that in a discussion of Romeo and Juliet, they spoilered out a character who died like in the third act. And I thought, wow, that's very serious. Now they did not spoiler out that Romeo and Juliet died. That was taken as a given. But it got me thinking about why spoilers don't bother me. And I think, some of it is like I grew up watching opera on PBS, and with opera, the whole story is in the program. There's an expectation that you know where things are going when you start out. Also, there are, a few operas that are really famous, so probably you've seen them before. But what's interesting is how you get there and what the choices are along the way, or, whether or not someone's going to stick the landing. And I think, just because you know where someone starts out and where someone ends, it's easy to kind of reduce their life to something or their choices to something. But instead, their motivations and their path and their journey can be very unique. And I think that's a real advantage when it comes to, even just interacting with people in general, but also in reading books that, even if you know where it's going, or even if you think you know where it's going, figuring out how they're going to get there, figuring out if they're going to stick the landing, if they've completely changed the setting, trying to figure out what they're going to do with that. I think there's still agency, even if something looks kind of boilerplate or simplistic on the outside.
These are such great questions. I'm just going to say really fast, in the realm of history and historical writing, if any of you, especially Emma, have not read, there is a really good article from, I think it was 2017, 2018, several years ago in Mormon History Association's Journal of Mormon History, and talking about agency and talking about women in history and finding that balance between attributing too much agency to women in the past and not attributing enough agency, acknowledging historical realities. So anyway, that's a really interesting thing to look at, because I know questions of agency, especially for women in the church, particularly currently or historically, are very important. So sorry, I can't remember the name of the author right off the bat, but I believe it's something like Women in Historical Agency. But those are very important questions, I think, in our church, and it's really interesting to look at how people work them out in fiction as well. Especially for youth, because again, I don't know, I grew up in the era of Janice Cat Perry and choice and accountability, and I'm sure we can all sing the songs about free agency. And so I think kind of a related question here from Rachel Helps. We'll go on to this one. I think we've got time to get to all our questions because we've got some good ones. But Rachel Helps asks, could the panelists revisit the idea of Mormons as retellers? Were any of you struck by anything about the retellings in your relation to your work for this or other papers? If we see ourselves as adapters and remixers, that has implications for our creative work. But do we see ourselves that way?
Well, since my whole presentation was focused on retellings, obviously I have seen that. I don't know if we exclusively see ourselves as adapters and remixers. There's obviously a lot more going on in Mormon literature than just retellings. And even some of the people I pointed out, it's not as if the majority of their work is still based in retellings. And people like Brandon Sanderson aren't retelling things either. He's kind of doing his own thing. I think in any kind of young literature or literature that isn't taken seriously, I think there's a fear of being provincial. And, there's a tendency to look down on women's literature. There's a tendency to look down on women writing things. There's a tendency to look down on YA. There's a tendency to look down on romance stories. So, and even though I did have a really long list of people I found who are doing story retellings, I think there were only 3 men on the list. And maybe that's telling in terms of, what we take seriously in terms of men writing fiction versus women writing fiction. So yeah, I think it's an interesting strain within our culture, retelling. I don't know if it really describes our culture in general, but I think it's something that maybe we struggle with in terms of wanting to be taken seriously versus, wanting to do something that we're interested in personally. And I think, each author kind of deals with that on their own way. I'm sorry I don't have something more concrete to say.
I think the way Rachel phrased this is really, really interesting. Because I think there's a fair argument that almost every, especially fantasy and science fiction, which is exclusively the realm I'm talking about, people who study literary fiction probably have completely different perspective on this. But these are genres with in some ways such a new invention that we can really trace origins of a lot of ideas and a lot of tropes and a lot of concepts to origin points, or at least to what we talk about as origin points. So in some sense, talking about magical speculative fantasy worlds is almost always talking about an adaptation of someone else's ideas. Brandon Sanderson is fully in conversation with Tolkien and Frank Herbert and Orson Scott Card. And like, you can draw those threads really, really easily, but you're just throwing out new ideas like Brandon Sanderson's talked about in Mistborn being like, well, like, what if the bad guy won? Like, what if the evil dictatorial king won? And you just go off of what if questions. But what if questions come from retellings and come from adaptations and come from being good readers. And so I think when you read well-written books, they have to in some way be responsive. And I think that there is an extent, and this goes back to what Kjerste said, somewhat tongue-in-cheek earlier, of the Book of Mormon just being a fan fiction of the New Testament. And I fully agree that that really looks down on fan fiction, because I can't think of a better compliment of writing really good fan fiction about a really good story. Like, adaptations and retellings are just being in conversation with other important ideas and adding new and important ideas to it. And I think most good books are good at that. And I think we write good books.
I might reframe the idea of Mormons being adapters and remixers to be that we're a very metatextual people because of this relationship between the Book of Mormon and the Bible, right? That we see, oh, this text in the Bible gets used in a different way here. Here's like this whole chunk of Isaiah and Second Nephi, surprise. But we also talk about how the things that the Book of Mormon meant for the people who were writing it at the time, but we believe it was written for our day. So we have this like, you know, adapting a text to ourselves and reinterpreting what it means is part of our culture, part of our scripture practice, that you go through your entire childhood reinterpreting texts and saying, okay, how do I interpret it now for my life? And so we're constantly being a little bit meta about everything we read in the scriptures, about how things relate to each other, acknowledging that they meant something different at one point and they mean something different if we look at it in this way. And so we have that mindset of looking for ways you might see something different. And that lends itself well to taking a story and finding the cracks in it, then we might retell it in an interesting way.
Those are also really interesting observations. And I think the same thing. I think as Mormons, we have really interesting relationships to texts because we don't view scripture as closed. We don't view the Bible as closed. We don't view the canon as closed. We view it as something we're participating in and that we can always, like you were saying, find some cracks in it, reinterpret it, reliken it to ourselves. And I think that really changes how we look at stories and narratives. Okay, we had a really interesting question specifically for Emma from Andrew Hall. And I actually, as he's saying this, I remember thinking this when I was reading the book Enna Burning. So Andrew notes, he says, in Enna Burning, she struggles with her firepower, and that struck me as perhaps symbolic of young people's struggles with and understanding and controlling of sexuality from an LDS understanding. And Andrew asks, does that ring true to you? She enjoys her power and she sees the good she can do with it, but she often feels like she's not in control of it. In the end, she finds a way to control and use it properly. And I actually remember thinking that when I read the book too. It's also been a while for me, but I guess that's the question for Emma. And it does also, I guess, kind of go with questions of agency and power. So I guess, what do you think? Do you feel like that's symbolic of that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I had not thought of it in that context, and I'm wondering how much of it is that I read this book for the first time when I was 12, and how much of it is just seeing this from really different perspectives. But I think looking back on the book, there's a really, really interesting reading there where that's about sexuality. I've always interpreted it as primarily about power. And to be fair, depending on which brand of feminist and queer theory, those can just be the same thing. But one of the interesting things that occurs throughout Enna Burning is how physical and embodied her power is. For people who haven't read this book or haven't read this book recently, Enna learns to speak to fire, and fire is a much more dangerous power than wind, which is the goose girl power. And so Anna sees her brother burned up from the inside because the fire consumes him. And she's really worried about that happening to her and almost dies when she loses control of her power. But the whole time she talks about a feeling in her chest and like this feeling of emptiness before she learned the power, and then a feeling of overwhelm once she did learn how to speak to fire. And just that recurrent idea of being too empty or too full, of not having enough of this power, of this passion, of the sexuality, of whatever it is, and then having that drain away. And this kind of need, once she knows what power feels like, to use and to exercise it, feels like a really, really interesting conversation, especially thinking about Latter-day Saints, young women's sexuality, young women's power, the way young women are asked to use these amazing divine gifts that we are told about, and then not often given an especially effective outlet for, especially in modern Latter-day Saint culture. And so I feel like there are so many different ways to interpret what that could stand for. But I find it a really, really powerful metaphor, especially for our culture and especially for women in our culture, and could fully be about sexuality. Yeah, I want to reread the book now thinking about that.
Well, and I think it's actually an interesting question to look at for, I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on this, with this idea of fairy tales, you know, kind of their parallel with romance, Disney movies. Since we're often writing for children or young adults, there is no sexuality in it. And even going back to that Spencer Kimball quote about, you know, any good woman and good man can make a successful marriage. I'm like, but what if they're not sexually compatible? That's going to be a long slog. Uh, but you know, that's a whole other big long conversation about sexuality in young adult literature. But it's interesting because many of these books, you know, they're going towards a pairing. They're going towards, you know, if we have parallels with Adam and Eve, there's also that embodiment and sexuality element there. But you know, many of them are going towards marriage, but they often are not really looking at any sort of, you know, embodied physical feelings or anything like that. That kind of seems to be set aside. So I don't know if anybody has anything else they want to say about that, or if we want to, we've got one more question. But that could be a whole other question panel for another time too. Because, you know, I just remember that, you know, as a youth, you talk a lot about marriage and young women's, but you don't talk about very much, except maybe kind of hee a little bit, like what you're going to actually do when you get married. So,
Oh, you weren't up at late at night at girls' camp, apparently, because that was what went on around the campfire.
Those campfire conversations were so important. But at risk of talking too much, I want to bring up Twilight, because that is what I am supposed to do at all points in my career. But Twilight has been noted by people who have no connection to the Latter-day Saint faith as one of the first mainstream young adult fiction novels where female sexuality is really prominent and is the driving sexuality of a book. And I find that so consistently interesting, because the, like, outside of this community and this academic culture, the two veins of Twilight academia are, why is it so conservative? No one talks about sex. There is no sex, versus, wow, Bella's so horny. And these are the two extremes. And the idea that those two things can coexist feels like a very distinctly Latter-day Saint reality of talking about young adolescent women's sexuality. And that there's got to be some in between there, but we talk about it in the two extremes. And I feel like that also could be very present, both in books like Matched and The Goose Girl, but in a lot of these other books that we could talk about on this subject. And I will mute myself now. Thank you.
No, I think that's a really good point. But yeah, that actually might be a really interesting presentation in the future, is looking more into that idea, because I think we do have that dichotomy in the church. I mean, we're supposed to get married and procreate, and yet we just can't talk about it. Okay, we have like 4 minutes, and I think that William had one more really good question about what role does community play in YA by Mormon authors, because I think as Mormons, we have a very particular idea of community, family, and compared to, I always hate the phrase the world, but compared to other cultures, Mormonism particularly has some very unique ideas on the value of community. So we'll give everybody just a couple minutes. I know Liz had something to say about community and YA books by Mormons.
Yeah, I just, when William asked this question, I immediately thought of, this is one of the reasons that Matched feels really different from some other YA dystopias, because Kjerste has a lot of adults that she gets advice from, that she can trust. Especially her grandfather is such a huge role model to her in, like, he's the one who initially sparks her questioning of the society at all, in saying like, you know, you need to have original thought and original words. And something I didn't have time to go into in my paper is how she looks back to the artistic community too with these poems, and eventually goes on to create an artistic community in the last book, and the importance of like the continuity of art as a way of like conveying thought. But yeah, her parents are there, which is like really weird for a dystopia, for you to have two parents who are there and like who are both struggling with the same thing she's struggling with, and she's watching them struggle and thinking, do I want to go the same way they do? Am I okay with burning books like my dad is burning books? My mom is making some tough choice. I wonder what she's thinking. And just that community aspect is much more there. And even in the Maze Runner, which is a bunch of boys who are on their own with one girl, they do form a sort of community and government to decide what to do. They have a council, and they get together and they all speak and decide what they're going to do as a community, rather than rebellion being chosen by one person on their own. So they do have a more community focused method of rebelling against the system, rather than one person goes off and finds this pre-existing rebellion or rebels on their own.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Goose Girl as well. You know, I mean, that's one part of it, is that she creates a community with the other animal workers, and they help her and she helps them. That's a very important part of that story as well.
Yeah.
Obviously Emma can speak more to that, but
Well, and one thing that's very, very rare in romance novels, and especially young adult romance novels still, is the idea of both being in a substantial and committed relationship and continuing to have close friendships outside of that. It's hard to write, and so it's very rarely written. But at the end of Enna Burning, while Enna's trying to figure out all of these powers, the way that Enna and Annie eventually figure out how to both be people who can speak to the wind or the fire is that they share their powers with each other. But Annie makes this really interesting comment that she'd tried to teach Jarek, her husband, how to use magic before, and it hadn't worked, but she thinks it will work with Enna because of how close they are. So there's this idea of like, Annie loves her husband, she loves her family, she loves her children, and she has this different and distinct relationship with her best friend that doesn't feel challenging to the marriage, doesn't feel challenging to the romance, but is just there as an essential part of both of them being safe and happy and well and powerful by the end of the story. And I hadn't realized this when I originally read the book, and it was only as I was doing work on my dissertation, but that's so rare and feels so distinct that this friendship is prioritized as much as any romantic relationship, and just written as an important part of making magic work.
I think that's really an interesting observation. There's a kind of newish romance writer, Emily Henry, that you've probably heard of, but her books are very good about that too as well. I love Emily Henry's books, and that's one reason why, is that the love interest exists in a community, and that part of the books, especially your most recent one, but all of them kind of have focus on this. The protagonists are whole people because they have relationships with other people as well as with their main love interest. Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about community, Kjerste, but I'm not sure if that really applies to fairy tales. Okay. We've reached our time, but we do have a little bit of time before the next presentation. Does anybody have any last thoughts they want to share, or good? I think this has been a fabulous group of presentations, some really interesting things. And thank you all so much for sharing with us, and thank you to our audience.